Okay, we're live.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Wikimedia Monthly Tech Talk for May. This month we'll be covering Wikimedia and the W3C. Our presenters are Evan Promodou, Product Manager, and Gilles Dubec, Senior Software Engineer. We will be broadcasting on the YouTube stream that you see in front of you. Our speakers will be talking for 45 minutes, and afterwards feel free to ask questions on the YouTube stream and the IRC channel, Wikimedia Office. I'll gather those and share those with the folks who are giving the talk. And if you have other questions that you want to ask afterwards, maybe something comes to you later, you can always ask those on the Monthly Tech Talks page. And before we get started, just a note that anybody can get involved in Tech Talks. There's a link down here, and we'll post this again after the talk. And without further ado, over to our speakers.
Hi, everybody. I'm Evan Promodou. I'm a product manager in the core platform group, and I am also the W3C advisory committee representative for the WMF. The foundation has only recently joined the W3C, and that means a lot of new processes for us and a lot of new opportunities. And so those of us who've been involved in the process of joining the W3C wanted to do this conversation to tell people in the foundation about the W3C and solve all the mysteries of what's going on with the W3C. So in this talk, we're going to talk about what the W3C is, why the foundation joined as a member, what we as a member of that consortium get out of the process, how the W3C process works, and then on a finer level, what it's like to represent the Wikimedia Foundation in a W3C group. So I'm going to talk as the AC rep, as the advisory, as the organizational representative. I'm going to talk about the kind of high level stuff, and we'll pause for questions after I finish, and then Gilles is going to take over and talk about his particular experience working with the web performance group at the W3C. So what is the W3C? The acronym is yet another interesting numbered acronym. It stands for the World Wide Web Consortium. That's three W's, so it becomes W3. The World Wide Web Consortium is an international community that develops open standards to ensure the long-term growth of the web. That's an important word, and I want to kind of highlight what a standard is. A standard is a defined format, whether it's a file format or a network protocol, or even a behavioral protocol, ways that people or organizations work together, that we agree on that lets different software on the web operate together. And that's really kind of what makes the web so magical, is that we've got all this software, whether it's browsers or servers, bots, that are all working together, written by different people without directly agreeing. We all agree on this one standard, and then we can work forward and do really interesting work together on it. Some of the best known standards you may have heard of from the W3C, HTML, CSS, XML, SVG, which is the vector graphics format. RDF is another one that is very important for doing structured data. HTTP, the W3C is involved in as the way that everything moves across the web. In fact, you could say that HTTP kind of is the web. EPUB is a publications format for books and other long-form publications. So when we say that W3C makes standards, these are some of the very important standards that the W3C makes. The organization was founded in 1994 by Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Sir Tim as people tend to call him, was the creator of the web, literally was the person who created the first standards, the first software, and he made the W3C in order to further that development work. So that instead of having a single organization that's involved with, that maintains the system, it is something that is shared by all the stakeholders involved in the web. W3C has a very interesting organizational structure. It's based in 4 different universities, both in the US and Europe, as well as in East Asia. There are 59 full-time staff members who work for the W3C, and there are 445 member organizations of the World Wide Web Consortium. Now, that word consortium is an interesting word that I also want to underline, because a consortium is an association, thank you, Wiktionary, an association of businesses and non-commercial institutions that are working on a joint venture. In the case of the W3C, the joint venture that we are creating is the World Wide Web. And so there are a number of different stakeholders who are involved in creating that World Wide Web. There are the obvious ones like browser vendors, Google, Mozilla, Microsoft, Apple, Opera, are all members of the W3C, and they participate in the standards process, excuse me, because it's important for them to make sure that the web is interoperable. Also, a lot of hardware makers, both for handheld devices, desktop devices, network switches, as well as chips. All kinds of hardware makers have a stake in the web. Network operators like Verizon, Viacom, Comcast, software vendors, especially folks who make server software, but to some extent, some other kinds of software. Apache Software Foundation is probably a familiar face there. IBM is a big player, SAP, Salesforce. Another type of member are web publishers. These are folks who are less involved in like software as a service or software that they are selling that uses the web, but really concentrating on single big sites. So that's anything from Facebook, Twitter, Baidu, Alibaba, Disney, the RAAA. So all kinds of publishers who are putting content out on the web have a stake in seeing the W3C standards move forward. Finally, there is a strong research aspect to the W3C's work. Often there are performance issues or breakthroughs in new technology. So universities also participate as full members in the W3C, Oxford, Stanford, MIT, and down the line. A lot in Europe and North America, but also quite a few in the Far East. So given that there are that many members in this large organization who are participating in the standards process, why did the WMF join? What is our stake in this? I think for anyone who's been involved in web development, there is a tendency to think of ourselves as passive players, that someone else is making the decisions about how web technology works. We say, oh, it would be great to have this page do this thing, but that's not really how the web works, or not all browsers support that mechanism, or it's too slow, or you need a plugin, or it's a proprietary extension that's needed to make this kind of thing work. And so we kind of take no for an answer in terms of pushing forward possible features for our communities, for our projects that simply don't work with the web as it is today. But it's important to remember that our projects are some of the biggest publications on the web. As the 5th biggest website, we are really a 800-pound gorilla on the web. And as one that is really focused on publishing, we're almost unique. Our software is some of the most used software on the web, just because people are using our software and generating pages over and over all day, every day. It's that way of thinking of being passive about the web and the advancement of the web doesn't really match with the Wikimedia Foundation of 2019. We are simply too big to be passive participants in the web. We owe it to our communities to take our seat at the table and make the web work for them. Our mission is simply too important to take no for an answer when it comes to the enabling stack of web technologies. We have to start saying, if it doesn't work that way, we need to change it so it does work that way. Part of our movement strategy for 2030 is to become the essential infrastructure of the ecosystem of free knowledge. And that means that we have to have the enabling network around us to connect with those who share our vision and to make the knowledge that we are enabling available throughout the world. And we really depend on the web to do that. Finally, and something that's really kind of important when we're talking about sharing free knowledge is that we've built up considerable institutional knowledge about performance using the web. Not just performance, but about different kinds of media technologies, internationalization, accessibility. We've learned a lot during the time that we've developed these projects, and the web needs to know what we know. We have a definite knowledge sharing opportunity here where we can make the web better based on what we've learned from experience. So, as members, what do we get out of this organizational membership? There aren't a lot of coffee cups or tote bags that we get out of becoming a member. What we do get is a place at the table to start making decisions about how web technology works. First and foremost, we can make improvements to existing technologies. We can literally ask for and get changes to existing web formats and protocols. If we think that a new HTML tag or a new CSS selector would make sense and make Wikipedia run faster, or let us deliver knowledge in a different way to a new set of audiences, that is something that we can actually move forward within the auspices of the W3C. We can also fix problems. If we have things that don't work right, that don't deliver the right kind of information in the ecosystem, we can actually start fixing problems in existing standards today. We can, as part of the W3C, propose new standards. If we think that there are new ways that, new kinds of knowledge that we'd like to share, new ways of interacting, protocols, ways to do things faster, cheaper, bigger, better, we can actually start new initiatives within the W3C, and all those players will have the opportunity and often a big incentive to implement what we propose. We also have, if not an absolute veto, we have an opportunity to stop breakage before it happens. As new web technologies come out, we get to give a thumbs up or thumbs down on every new standard that comes out. So if there's something that is proposed that's going to cause problems for one of our projects or cause an undue burden on our systems, we can actually say, hey, this isn't going to work for us, or it's going to need some changes before it will work for us. So we don't have to wait until something is has long been implemented in all the browsers before we say, hey, this is garbage. We get to, give our thumbs up and thumbs down very early in the process. Finally, we get to participate with the other members in setting the direction for the W3C. From a high-level strategy, we can say, we think these things are important, we think these things are less important, and we'd like to see the organization developing new strategies in these different areas. So those are a number of things that we can do to influence the development of the web as members of W3C. How it works in in particular is very interesting and very distributed. The W3C's primary focus for developing new technologies and new standards is a entity that are called groups. And there are actually a bunch of different kinds of groups, which I'm going to get into. But these groups are specific working groups that are made up of participants from lots of the member organizations that are focusing on specific areas of the web that we want to move forward or improve. Each of these groups has a focus on a particular area, and the groups are really empowered by the W3C and the member organizations to make a lot of changes in those areas. So those groups are responsible for writing the standards documents that define how the new technology will work. The groups often meet regularly, so they have regular teleconferences, IRC meetings, or they meet in person. Usually the groups have mailing lists for doing some wordsmithing and working out how things are going to work. The groups collect requirements both from within the member organizations as well as the web at large to make decisions about how things are going to move forward. Often these groups will work on reference implementations for a new technology. So being able to say, hey, we know we have a proof of concept that this would work. And if you're not sure of best practices on how to work, look at the code for this open source reference implementation. Those groups answer questions that come from outside the organization, and they are also really the main decision makers on these technologies. So the essential parts of the decisions are made at this group level. At a higher level, the W3C and the member organizations can kind of vote up or vote down a full standards document, but at the fine level of, per paragraph, making decisions about the way the technology works, that's really up to the groups. Groups are anywhere from a dozen people to 100 people for the larger groups, but they tend to be pretty tight-knit in terms of who's participating in the groups. Like I said before, the group participants are either representatives of member organizations, so people from WMF, for example, or invited experts. Occasionally there are academics or third parties who've shown exceptional knowledge in an area, and they'll be invited to join a group as an invited expert, but typically as representatives of member organizations. And although there is a level of familiarity and knowledge that's important for group participants, interest in the focus area is probably the most important one. I think that having some motivation to work on the technology is probably the biggest part of what makes a good group participant. So like I said, there are different kinds of groups at the W3C. The most visible are so-called quote-unquote working groups. These are groups that have been set up by the member organizations to produce a standards document. They are going at the end of their process. They're chartered for a particular amount of time. At the end of that time, they need to have a document that defines a new web standard. There are currently 32 working groups. These groups kind of come and go based on when they get a new standard out or when it comes back in. I've already talked about some of the better known standards that have been around, like CSS and HTML. There are also some really interesting newer working groups that are working on web standards for things like immersive web is for VR, virtual reality, augmented reality. Web payments is for doing payments over the web, which is really interesting in a vendor independent way. Web authentication for using different kinds of authentication mechanisms. They just published a really great system for doing authentication with hardware keys, so you can use various kind of hardware keys from the web, WebAssembly, web fonts, and like I said, 32 more of these kind of more better known working groups. These working groups kind of can produce different kinds of documents, typically as they're moving down this level of draft documents to candidate recommendations. They become more formalized. They need to have more levels of test suites and implementations before they can move to the next step. By the time a document becomes a W3C recommendation, it needs to have at least 3 independent implementations, a full test suite. It has to be voted on by the membership. So the member organizations have to vote on it and say, yes, we really do want to push this out. So it is a pretty high bar to actually get through this life cycle of a document. Typically, a single standard will take somewhere around 1 to 2 years to go from its first draft to a recommendation. Often, technologies aren't quite there yet, right? So with bringing out a new version of CSS, that's something where there are probably some minor changes that are being added. Sometimes there are new technologies that are in the area of being explored currently. For this kind of interest area, the W3C has a system called community groups. This is where a group of people from the member organizations and the larger community of people involved in the web can explore an important area before it's quite ready to have this formal standardization process. So there are currently, community groups are a little bit easier to get started, and there are 342 community groups at the W3C right now. All kinds of interesting, processes. There's a really good one for augmented reality, kind of supporting that immersive web one, for automotive web interfaces, for conversational interfaces, so chat-based interfaces, using the web for agriculture. I'm involved in one called the Social Web Incubator Group that is involved with standards for social web protocols. The WebML community group is one that I think is really interesting. It's one that's doing browser-side machine learning, so putting machine learning resources on the browser end so that users are really in control of the AI that's developing around their behavior. Another really kind of cool system. I think community groups are a lot easier to get involved with, and they also happen to be doing, some of the coolest stuff in the web. One last kind of group, which is sometimes called interest group. I call them horizontal groups. There's this process called horizontal review. They are really involved with improving all the standards that come out in a particular way. So what will happen is that there will be people who have expertise in a certain aspect of technology that's not on a particular thing like CSS or HTML, but instead is something like accessibility, internationalization, security, privacy, participation of underrepresented groups, having a positive work environment. These are groups that, as documents move through that process that I was talking about before, they will get reviewed by these kind of horizontal groups that say, okay, you've done a really good on-the-wire protocol definition, but how well does it support right to left scripts, or how well does it support people with poor eyesight? How well does it protect the privacy of end users? And so these horizontal groups can be really great ways for folks to advocate for a certain aspect of web technologies across all different standards that the organization is doing. So within the Wikimedia Foundation, it's possible for anyone to join one of these groups, and that's really the main way to get involved. If you have knowledge of or interest in an area of web technology, joining one of these groups can be a great way to kind of develop that. Typically, you're looking at about 1 hour per month up to about 8 hours per month of involvement. Anyone who has a wikimedia.org email address is welcome to join. We're just trying to figure out if folks outside the organization that are closely involved should be representing us there. It hasn't come up yet, but it's something we're definitely aware of. In order to join a group, you have to sign up for a W3C account. That's on the W3.org website. You have to sign up with your wikimedia.org email address, and that'll automatically connect you to the WMF organization. You should have a group in mind that you're interested in, and they're listed out on the website. You ask to become a member just by clicking on a link on the group page. There's a quick confirmation process on my side where I make sure, as the AC member, I make sure that yes, you really are with the Wikimedia Foundation. Yes, you understand the responsibilities, and that's it. You're in. Again, if you don't have a wikimedia.org email address, but you think that you should be representing the WMF at one of these groups, let's talk, and we'll see what happens there. I talked a little bit before about what these groups do, but the responsibilities of being a member, at the very least, lowest level of involvement, you have to be on the mailing list. It's kind of recommended that you attend the meetings. Typically, there are meetings, say, once a month or once every 2 weeks or once a week, often on IRC or by telephone. There are occasionally in-person meetings. There are big group meetings on an annual basis, but there are also, say, per group meetings. Sometimes happen quarterly or bi-yearly. So that's something that you can do. Getting involved with reviewing drafts, voting on proposals, kind of getting knowledgeable about the work of the group. Most of the groups do most of their work on GitHub. So, tracking issues through GitHub, making pull requests to actually update documents. There is also a software development aspect to a lot of this work. So not only producing document, but creating tests and test suites, and even doing implementations, whether it's an open source implementation that's part of the group or implementing the standards as part of the Wikimedia Foundation stack. At the very highest level of involvement, each of these documents has an assigned editor who's responsible for the document. So that is a very high level of involvement. Some of these in-person meetings, the in-person meetings are hosted by members' organizations. So if you want to take a shot at hosting a meeting for one of the, for a group you're in, that's a possibility. And then finally, chairing a group means that you take responsibility for getting the documents from beginning to end, arranging meetings, handling all the membership processes. It's a pretty big responsibility, but it can really mean the difference between a group being successful and one that doesn't quite deliver. On a note about obligations as a member of one of these groups, as a representative for the Wikimedia Foundation, there is a code of conduct. People are expected to behave professionally. As an international organization, the W3C's code of conduct is very aware of organizational and national cultural differences in the way that people conduct business, which I think that we also are at the WMF, but at the same time, expecting that we will be productive members of these groups. Almost all the work that W3C groups do is released either under a W3C software license, which is a permissive license, very similar to like the MIT license or VSD license. All the content's produced under the same license as a documentation license. So again, very permissive. We have to disclose any patents that we have on any of the technology that comes out, which I think is less of a big deal for the WMF than it is for IBM or Disney, but it's still something that we have to do. I think also that anyone who's in these groups should probably remember that that you're there to advance our projects in our community, or at least make the web a better place. So I've really talked about how participating in the W3C can be a big part of how the WMF makes the web a better place. Obviously, it's a very, it's a big web. There are different kinds of relationships that we can develop. The W3C is not the only standards group that's involved, that's around for technology, and we can always be members of more standards groups. Seems like W3C is a very focused one. Our participation in open source projects is another place where our relationships can help to develop the web. And we also have bilateral relationships with platform providers and other web participants. But I think that the W3C is a big place for us to have an impact on how the web goes forward. So I'm gonna stop here, and we're gonna move now, and I'm gonna hand things over to Gilles. But I wanna take a second before we do that and ask, I haven't actually been collecting questions, so I'm gonna pause for a second and see if we have any questions on what I've discussed so far. And I might need to look in the
This is Sarah, and I'm looking at the IRC chat, and we also have to give a little bit of a lag for the live stream because folks will get that just like a moment after us. So
no problem. And I'm also okay if we save our questions till the end. So if we don't have anything that's ready right now, I'd like to hand it. Whoop! I'm gonna bring up slides again, and we'll hand it over to Gilles to talk about his experience representing the WMF at the W3C. Let me see if I can get this live.
Hi. So before the foundation joined a couple of months ago, I was invited as an invited expert to the Web Performance Working Group at W3C last summer, so almost a year ago. And I wanted to talk about that experience, what it's like to represent the foundation there. So I have to say that I started participating remotely, and then I got to meet everyone at TPAC, which is the big all-hands meetings where all the working groups and community groups meet once a year. And I got to meet the people I was working with face-to-face. And like Evan mentioned, a lot of groups have face-to-face meetings throughout the year on their own, like independently. And so I think in terms of participation for anyone who's interested, I did feel a big difference before and after meeting people face-to-face. There was a lot of trust involved, and I could see the effect of me bringing things up on the mailing list before and not getting a lot of response. Then after meeting people were paying more attention to what I was saying, and I got to create real working relationships with them. So something that was very positive for me in terms of experience was how much browser vendors are eager to hear our opinion about things, what we care about, what works for us, what doesn't work for us. Because the issue, at least in the working group that I'm involved in, is that for the most part, it's browser vendors discussing standards between each other because they're the ones that are ultimately going to implement them. And to understand the needs of their users, as in web developers who use their standards, they usually ask around in their own organizations. And so Google will hear about Google Maps, they will hear from Gmail, and Microsoft will hear from Bing. And those are very specific websites that don't have the same needs as our projects do at all. And so, when I showed up, and they were very, very curious to hear, and those standards, what was working for us and what wasn't. Like, they care a lot about making things work for the web, and the fact that Wikimedia sites are a very different kind of website than what they usually deal with is very interesting for them. And so they're very, very much interested in what we have to say. I was also very pleasantly surprised by how much influence I was able to have very quickly. Like, in the very first meetings I attended, I was already, swaying priorities or decisions about standards that were being worked on. Also, giving them very precise feedback about some APIs that were being developed meant that they were adjusted to meet our needs. When in the past, I've dealt with a lot of browser standards, and like Evan said, like, sometimes it doesn't quite do what we want. Like, it almost does what we want, but not quite. And I realized by being there that I can actually make it do what we want, when it's being created, which is exactly what we were hoping for. And it has already happened for several standards that are in the works. And also, as part of this, so Chrome, like Google, tends to be the organization that implements things first for a lot of standards, at least in the performance realm. And one way that I got involved was to do what they call Chrome origin trials. So as they are trying new experimental standards before, like, they're getting drafted and presented to the group, they sometimes implement them in Chrome, and you can try them out using this system. And essentially, it allows me to give very, very early feedback on some of the ideas that are being developed for standards, for new standards in that working group. And this has been very, very effective. Have been getting, very quick turnaround feedback from the folks at Google that are presenting new standards and influencing the shape it is taking. So overall, I have to say it has been a very, very positive experience, and basically they've been waiting for people like us to show up. Like, for the most part, most of the discussions are between browser vendors, and not many, like we've seen that there's a lot of publishers that are also members of the organization, but they're not necessarily participating actively in those discussions. And the fact that I am there and I'm representing a user, and a large one at that, makes the people in the group listen to me a lot, because the Facebooks of the world, and those other big organizations don't necessarily speak up about a lot of the standards that are being developed. So the fact, like, we're kind of filling a void, if you will, like they're waiting to hear from actual users, and the fact that we are there and talking makes a big difference, and we can get our opinion heard, which is probably going to be quite different from all of the commercial vendors that are, or commercial properties that are represented in the consortium. So yeah, that's my experience, and I highly recommend that anyone who cares about the movement steps up and joins working groups to represent our needs and wants. Thank you. So I guess we can get back to questions now.
Awesome. That sounds good. Thank you so much. So I'm looking at the IRC channel. I'm going to start looking through the questions that have come up. And I'll start off with Subu, who asks, are there community groups you think WMF staff should definitely be joining? That is a really good question. There are some groups that I think are really interesting for us, and I think at least. All right, cool. So I think we have some participation already on some of the ones that are most important. So the one Gilles involved in is the web performance working group. And this is a working group that is specifically about tools and techniques for getting great performance out of web systems, right? So it's making changes to the measurement and the tools for getting web performance, up to the top. And since that's such an important part of publishing for our projects, that's one that I really am glad that we have some presence on. There is a brand new group that is involved with publishing media. So for those folks who have worked with things like audio and video tags and HTML, different styles and types of file formats for video, this is a new group that's going to be kind of building from the bottom up that same process. I would love to see, especially as we are looking to develop more rich content in our projects. I know that in the past, problems with patent encumbered formats or performance of some of the different mechanisms, control of the mechanisms for delivering media has inhibited our ability to use the web for delivering media. So I think the new media group would be one that would be a huge help for WMF staff. In terms of, I talked a little bit about some of the horizontal groups. Our experience, again, with internationalization and languages is probably second to none on the web in terms of the scope of languages that we deliver, that we have projects for. And so I think that getting involved with internationalization and supporting internationalization in new standards as well as existing standards would be really helpful to that organization, and especially helpful for our projects that maybe are having problems with representation on the web for underrepresented languages. So those are a few that are I think the most interesting. However, like I said, there's like 340 community groups. There's another 32 working groups that are working right now on new standards. And I think that those are pretty cool ones too. Oh, I talked a little bit about the immersive web one, the VR AR one. I think that we probably have a part to play in that world in terms of delivering more information. So it's pretty easy to find these groups, and joining them is pretty straightforward too.
So Chris asked if the performance group is a horizontal group, and the answer is no. It probably should be. I think it's because historically the way the web performance group emerged was through standardizing metric collection, and that was the main focus. But yes, the same way that there's a security and privacy horizontal group, it probably should be a performance horizontal group to check that new standards and new APIs don't slow down browsers. It's actually a very good point. I'll bring it up on the next working group meeting. And Subu was asking us to speak about the relationship between W3C and WhatWG. So yes, there is. So my understanding is that WhatWG became popular, emerged out of frustration of the very strict process in the W3C, and they've taken ownership of some standards that you might have thought would normally live in the W3C world, and it is creating a little bit of friction, but a lot of those standards that are interconnected are in the process of being synchronized between both, as in standards made under the W3C are referencing what WG standards and vice versa, and they're trying to work together to make all that stuff work well. So yes, I mean, the web is a bigger ecosystem, it doesn't stop at the W3C, so of course you have to make it work, and I also encourage people who are interested to also join those other organizations. You know, we don't have to stop at the W3C. There's a lot of other work being done in other areas of the web that we need to participate in. So, you know, check out what WG is doing as well, and maybe you're going to be finding things that are more relevant to you and that other organization.
Yeah, I think it's it is an interesting relationship. Like what WG kind of forked off as a kind of faster moving process, and what has happened is that a lot of that has been reintegrated into W3C, and a lot of what WG frustration about slow moving process with the W3C. Again, this was like in the late 2000s, has largely been reflected in changes to the way the W3C works, right? And right now they do remain as two separate organizations, but really kind of what WG is a feeder that is creating new technologies that are really becoming part of the HTML and CSS standards. So a lot of the same people are involved in both organizations, and I don't think there's as much of a conflict as there was before during that kind of fork period. And the other thing is that what WG does do does a lot of focus on HTML and CSS, to some extent JavaScript APIs, but there is a lot more to what the W3C does, right? So W3C covers a lot of other kinds of data structures, and et cetera, that do exist on the web. I wanted to ask you, Gilles, do you have working groups or other groups that you think we should have more people participating in?
I think definitely CSS, internationalization, SVG. You know, we rely a lot on SVG, and you know, it's been a pain point for us, like the support of some SVG features, etc., and open source stacks that we rely on. So yeah, I mean, I encourage anyone to check out the list, because there's a lot more happening at the WMF that I'm not aware of that probably makes some groups relevant.
Yeah. So we had a round of once we announced that we were joining the W3C. We had a round of folks who jumped in. I think we're now at around 15 people from the WMF who have accounts on the W3C and are members of different groups. I might need to, it'll take me a second to pull it up, but I remember off the top of my head that we do have someone on SVG, on internationalization, on web performance, on social standards. So there has been a lot of activity already so far, and it definitely doesn't hurt to have more people get involved, and especially for those things that matter for us: security, privacy, internationalization, accessibility. I want to go back and check and see if we have any other questions on IRC.
I just checked the live stream and we don't have any questions there. And okay. I asked a while ago, so so I'm not sure we're going to get questions on the live stream this morning.
That's not a problem. All right, great. Well, if that's the case and we don't have any questions, I think we're all set. Is there anything you'd like to say to kind of finish up, Gil?
Please get involved. Join groups. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I just also wanted to say, I'll put a link to the Tech Talks both in the IRC channel and on the live stream. We'll post a link to this from that Tech Talks page as well. And then any of the questions that folks answered today or asked or answered today will be added to that too. And then anybody in the future, if you are interested in doing a Tech Talk of your own, please reach out. And thank you so much. We totally appreciate that you came and talked with us about this today.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. It was great being involved.
Yeah.